The courtroom was filled with a tense silence as the jury's decision hung in the air. Tamar McIntyre, accused of capital murder, stood motionless as the foreperson read the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant Tamar McIntyre not guilty of the offense of capital murder. The room was still for a moment, before an outburst erupted from the defendant's supporters. But the judge's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Excuse me, no, out of the courtroom now." As the courtroom cleared, the gravity of the decision weighed heavily on everyone. Tamar had been acquitted of the capital murder charge, but his journey was far from over. The court would now proceed to sentencing, and the consequences of his actions were still looming large. "The court is going to sentence you to 70 years in prison," the judge declared, a clear and final sentence ringing through the air. The room seemed to hold its breath. The judge's voice was unyielding, but it was clear the decision was not taken lightly. Tamar, at only 20 years old, had his entire future ahead of him. But this was the harsh reality of the system he found himself entangled in. "Even a day in prison is a lot of time," the judge remarked somberly. And for Tamar, the time ahead seemed insurmountable. He had already served some time, but the path forward was uncertain. The judge continued, his voice softening, "But the gravity of the moment undeniable, and with you it's 40 years. Tamar, looking up at the judge, could hardly comprehend the weight of those words. The world outside this courtroom seemed to blur as the sentences continued to stack up in his mind. His youth, his mistakes, the life he had yet to live. It was all slipping away in that single moment. The judge's words resonated with an unexpected sense of finality. "You're 20 years old," the judge said. "If you end up in prison for the rest of your life, you're still alive. You still have the chance to improve yourself." Tamar's mind raced. What did improvement mean for him now? What could he become after all the destruction, after the mistakes and choices he had made? The judge was giving him a sliver of hope, a suggestion that redemption was still possible, however improbable it seemed. "You need to take advantage of whatever is available in prison to better yourself," the judge emphasized, the words cutting through the haze of confusion and fear Tamar had been living in. Tamar's life, up until this point, had been marked by instability and violence. At a young age, he had become involved in criminal activity. His story was not one of opportunity or guidance. It was one defined by missed chances and a lack of support. As the judge reflected on his past, it became clear how his childhood experiences had shaped him into the young man standing before the court. Tamar had been caught up in the chaos of life at a young age. He had been one of 5 accused in a deadly robbery outside Fort Worth at just 16 years old. Then, just months later, while on house arrest, Tamar made the fateful decision to cut off his ankle monitor and go on the run. This decision would eventually link him to the brutal capital murder of 23-year-old Mark Anthony Salivad on April 23, 2017. The shooting outside a Chick-fil-A near North Star Mall became the defining moment in Tamar's life, a moment that would lead to this very courtroom. As the trial progressed, Kevin Luna, another man implicated in the case, made little effort to speak publicly about the crime. News cameras caught him walking past with nothing more than a passing comment, "I don't know why people..." His words trailed off, leaving behind an uncomfortable silence. The focus shifted back to the evidence. Surveillance footage that was set to reveal critical details of the crime. The defense, still in the dark about some of the discovery, awaited the release of video evidence. "We're still awaiting the discovery on that, Judge," was the response from the defense, underscoring the ongoing uncertainties in the case. The judge, ever the patient mediator, pressed for clarity. "Where are we on the surveillance videos?" The legal battle was becoming a matter of waiting for more answers, for more discovery to be shared. But there was no time to waste, and the case continued to unfold with increasing tension. The defense, still seeking the best possible outcome for their client, focused on requesting mitigation. They pleaded for the court to consider Tamar's difficult past, to understand the trauma that had shaped him into the person he was today. Tamar's defense team argued that his upbringing, marked by absence and neglect, had influenced his choices. He didn't have a mother. She gave him up, the defense explained. His father was incarcerated for domestic violence against his mother. These personal accounts painted a grim picture of a young boy lost in the world, without the protection of a loving family. He was lost, the defense continued. He didn't have guidance. Yet the prosecution, focused solely on the crime, remained unmoved by these pleas for understanding. The state's position is clear, the prosecutor stated. This was a capital murder, and Tamar must be held accountable. There was no room for leniency in the eyes of the law. The state demanded justice for Mark Anthony Salivad and his grieving family. The punishment must reflect the gravity of the crime, the prosecution added, reinforcing the severity of Tamar's actions. As the courtroom drama reached its peak, the judge, after hearing the arguments from both sides, turned to Tamar. "You still have a chance to better yourself," the judge reiterated. Tamar had a choice, a difficult one, but it was still his to make. If he wanted to change, to build a future beyond the prison walls, it would take hard work and determination. The judge continued to speak, reminding Tamar of the life he could still have. "You're still alive. You can still improve." But for Tamar, those words seemed far away, distant and disconnected from the harsh reality he was now facing. Time would tell whether he could truly redeem himself in the unforgiving environment of prison, but the road ahead was long and uncertain. As the session continued, the reality of Tamar's sentence began to sink in. The judge would deliver his final ruling, and Tamar's future would be set in stone. For now, Tamar's fate remained uncertain. But one thing was clear: the time he would spend in prison would define the rest of his life. And it was up to him to decide how he would spend that time, whether he would rise above his circumstances or remain lost in the shadows of his past. These personal details of Tamar's childhood struck a chord with some in the room. They painted a picture of a boy who never received the nurturing, the care, or the guidance every child deserves. His story was one of neglect, of brokenness, and ultimately, of a system that failed him at every turn. The defense lawyer argued that these circumstances should not be ignored. He was lost, the defense continued. He didn't have any guidance. He was left to navigate a world that was cruel and unforgiving. Tamar, at just 20 years old, had already been entangled in a web of violence, crime, and imprisonment. His involvement in a deadly robbery at just 16, followed by his decision to cut off his ankle monitor while on house arrest, showed a young man desperate to escape the restraints placed on him by society. This, the defense argued, was the result of a lifetime of instability, not an inherent criminal nature. However, the prosecution was unwavering in its position. The facts of the case were clear. Tamar was accused of taking the life of 23-year-old Mark Anthony Salivad in a brutal act of violence. The shooting, which took place outside a Chick-fil-A near North Star Mall, was not an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern of behavior that had led Tamar to this courtroom. This was a capital murder, the prosecutor asserted. Tamar must be held accountable for the life he took. The tension in the room was palpable as both sides presented their final arguments. The jury had found Tamar not guilty of capital murder, but the charge of lesser murder still loomed large. The question now was what sentence would be appropriate for the crime. Tamar's defense team hoped for leniency, arguing that he could still turn his life around. "You're 20 years old," the defense said. "You still have a chance to change, to better yourself. The time you serve doesn't have to define you." Yet despite these pleas, the prosecution reminded the court of the severity of Tamar's actions. The victim is dead. He will never have the chance to improve himself, to grow old, to have a family. Tamar's actions took that away from him, the prosecutor stated. It was a sobering thought. In the end, the question was not just about Tamar's future, but about justice for the victim and his family, who would never see their loved one again. As the sentencing continued, the judge addressed Tamar directly. "You have a chance to improve yourself," the judge said, the words ringing in Tamar's ears. "But you must take that chance. The prison system offers programs to help you grow, to help you better yourself. It's up to you to take advantage of them." But Tamar, standing there in the courtroom, could hardly grasp the enormity of what the judge was saying. How could he change? How could he improve in a place that was built to break people down? His past had been shaped by violence and neglect, and now, it seemed, his future would be spent behind bars. The judge continued, speaking not just to Tamar but to everyone in the room. You still have a life to live. Even if it's in prison, you can still make something of it, the judge emphasized. The road ahead would not be easy, but the opportunity for redemption, however slim, still existed. In the midst of this, Tamar's defense team raised another issue: his desire to maintain contact with his daughter, Cassandra. Despite the court order prohibiting contact with his ex-partner, the defense argued that Tamar should still be allowed to have limited contact with his daughter. He loves his daughter, the defense attorney said. He doesn't want her to think that he doesn't care about her, that he's abandoning her. This request struck an emotional chord with some in the courtroom. Tamar, despite his past, still longed to connect with his daughter, to maintain a relationship with her, even if it meant doing so from behind bars. But the prosecution, understanding the complexity of the situation, argued that Tamar's history of violence and the protection orders in place meant that no contact should be allowed. There's a lifetime protective order against Mr. Rodriguez, the prosecutor reminded the court. He should not have contact with his daughter. It was a painful decision, one that highlighted the lasting effects of Tamar's actions not just on the victim's family, but on his own as well. As the court deliberated, Tamar's thoughts turned inward. What had his life become? He was still a young man, but his future was now set in stone. A life sentence for a 20-year-old seemed incomprehensible, yet it was the reality he had to face. The road to redemption was far, and the prison system would be his battleground. But the possibility of change, of growth, remained distant and uncertain. The judge, after careful consideration, pronounced the final sentence. The court is going to sentence you to 80 years in prison, with credit for any time served. The weight of those words felt like a crushing blow. Tamar had already been through so much, and now, his future was defined by the cold, unyielding walls of a prison cell. The sentence was harsh, but it was the law. There would be no parole, no second chances, just 80 years to reflect, to change, or to remain trapped in the same cycle of violence and regret. As Tamar was led away from the courtroom, the reality of his situation finally settled in. The chance for redemption, for a life outside of prison, was now a distant dream. But the judge's final words echoed in his mind. You still have a chance to improve yourself. For Tamar, the future would be shaped not by the mistakes of his past, but by the choices he made in the coming years. And whether he would take that opportunity to change, or let it slip away, was entirely up to him.